Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for attending today's IBM Middleware User Community Ask the Expert session. My name is Kelsey Tipshraney and I'll be hosting today's webcast. Our topic for today is understanding managed status in ITNM. All phone lines are currently in listen-only mode. There will be a question and answer session towards the end of the presentation. However, you may ask a question at any time during the presentation using the questions window located in the control panel. Also look for a forum link in your chat box right now and feel free to continue any discussions after the webcast and this forum. Tomorrow we'll have the recording and slides of today's presentation available on the IBM Middleware User Community website for you to access. You'll receive a follow-up email with a link to those archives. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. We have joining us Bruce Urquhart and Krishna Kodeli, both ITNM support or software support engineers with IBM. Thank you, Bruce and Krishna, for joining us today. The floor is now yours.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bruce Urquhart, and I'll be presenting the first portion of the presentation. As you can see on the first slide here, on slide number 2, today's agenda will cover background on managed status, maintenance mode, i.e. unmanaged status, unmanaged by disco mode. Then we'll look at the rules for setting the value of managed status of an entity. We'll then move on to status propagation. We'll talk a little bit about events, some RCA, and then Krishna will talk more about the tag managed entities stitcher. So if we can move on to the next slide, Krishna. On the screen here you can see the different values that managed status can have. We have 0, 1, 2, and 3, 0 being that the entity is managed. In addition to a 0, you can have a null value, which also corresponds to a entity being managed. 1 unmanaged state, this is an entity that has been set to unmanaged via the GUI or the Perl scripts. Number 2 is a permanently unmanaged state. This setting cannot be modified by the GUI. This value has been set by the tag managed entity stitcher. And number 3 is unmanaged because the IP address is out of the discovery scope. It has typically been discovered through another IP address that is within the discovery scope, and this is also set by the tag managed entity stitcher. We can move on to the next slide. So a little background for 3.9. Data is stored in models master.entity by name, and also optionally in Disco's scratch topology entity by name. And this field is an extra info managed m_managed status field. In model is the master, and its managed status value is what's used by RCA. Because the managed status is a subfield in the extra info field, a record is not necessarily present in Disco or model. If an entity record does not have the field extra info, m_managed status, then ITNM is going to treat this record as if it has a managed status of 0. In other words, as I mentioned before, entities are considered to be managed by default. If we can move on to the next slide. Sorry, we're already there. For 4.x, things are a little different. There's no extra info field in Disco nor model. The managed status is now stored in a managed status table in dnsim and nsim cache being the equivalent of the model. And this is because Disco's scratch topology.entity by name is now dnsim. Again, model is the master and its managed status value is used by RCA. This is the same as in 3.9. and entities with no record in the managed status tables will also indicate a managed status of 0, i.e. it's managed by default. Next slide, please. Managed status is also stored in NSIM, in the NSIM managed status table. The reason for this being a separate table is because the most common customer use case is to unmanage a device to perform maintenance on that device rather than to unmanage a single subcomponent. So any subcomponent inside an unmanaged chassis is considered to be unmanaged too. There's no need to add every interface to the NSIM managed status table in this case, as it would be redundant information. However, if an entry in NSIM is required for an interface, then a row for the interface must be inserted or updated if the row already exists. If you want to check, if you want to check for a row already existing, you can perform an SQL select statement. Slide 7. So talking a little bit more on background, there are different representations of managed status in the relational database, in the relational model, the NSIM database, and the object model. Object model needs to have the managed status explicitly assigned to every interface because that is what's required for the gateway and the RCA processes. In model, if an entity has a managed status of 1, 2, or 3, it will have all its events excluded from RCA processing. Finally, with the NSIM.managedStatus table, this is a table that's excluded from the model NSIMDB.cfg file. This is a special case table that can be updated by the GUI and the disco process, unlike all other tables in that file, for which the data comes exclusively from the disco process. And next slide. So moving on to maintenance mode, i.e. if a device or entity is unmanaged. This is typically a temporary state where a set of devices or interfaces will be taken offline for some form of maintenance and then either removed from the network or brought back online. While in maintenance mode, operators will not need to respond to any alerts. To do so, to unmanage a device, you can right-click on a device or interface and select Unmanage, or you can use the unmanaged node.perl script. Both of these are going to set the managed status to 1, and this can only happen if the current managed status is set to 0. The reverse can be done to manage the device. Right-click and select Manage, or use the managed node.perl script. The advantage of using these scripts is that you can use the bulk capability with a list of IPs in a file if you want to manage or unmanage a number of devices. In addition, we have the remove node.perl script, which essentially sets the managed status to 1 and then sets the linger time to 0. This is true for 3.9 and 4.1.1. This script is used to remove devices from the topology, but then you have to wait for another discovery to take place before the actual devices are removed. By setting the managed status to 1, you're preventing the device from being polled. This is for any device you're basically going to remove, so you're not interested in polling it anymore. In 4.2, this has changed. There is no managed status change on that Perl script. A device is removed from the NSIM cache immediately and subsequently is removed from the NSIM database. So you don't actually have to wait for another discovery to run. So moving on to the next slide. Continuing on with maintenance mode. Any changes to the managed status via the GUI or the scripts is done by an SQL insert update statement to the managed status table in NSIM. Model will then receive these updates as it automatically polls the managed status table every 30 seconds. This is a setting in the model schema config file. It's the managed status update interval field. Any changes that model receives will be broadcast to the event gateway, which are then used for event enrichment, including RCA. In addition, we also have to take into consideration the poller, which also checks the table, the model, the NSIM managed status table, and it also checks it at 30-second intervals by default. And this will reset the internal poll scope so that we know what to poll and what not to poll, i.e. anything that's managed with a managed status value of 0 or null will be polled. Anything with a 1, 2, or 3 is not polled. And this field is the same name, managed status update interval, but it's in the NC poller schema config file. Next slide. Unmanaged by disco mode. So unlike the temporal nature of the maintenance mode, the unmanaged by disco does not usually fluctuate. This is set automatically during discovery based on some attribute criteria that's set in the tag managed entity stitcher for certain interfaces. This sets the managed status to 2 or 3. Managed status equals to 3 indicates an entity is unmanaged because it is out of the discovery scope. And the GUI and the manage and unmanaged Perl scripts are not going to allow you to unmanage an entity that has already been set by disco. Excuse me, are not going to allow an entity that is unmanaged by disco to change its state. Slide 11, covering some rules for setting the value of managed status of an entity. Managed status values are stored in model. As we mentioned in 3.9, that's the master.entity by name table. In 4.11 and 4.2, that's changed to the NSIM cache.managed status table. These values are also stored in the NSIM.managed status table. Managed status values can be altered by NCP disco, i.e. thresh topology.entity by name in 3.9 and dNSIM.managed status table in 4.x, and these are then sent to topology, the topology center model. The GUI can alter the value of the NSIM managed status tables via an SQL interface to NSIM. And there are rules about which managed status values can be set by disco and the GUI. And these rules also depend on what was already set for those values. And we have a couple of tables that we're going to look at that summarize the rules that apply to chassis and subcomponents. So on the next slide, slide 12 here, we have managed status values that DISCO can set. So if you have a managed status of 0, is DISCO allowed to set it to 0? Well, yes, it's already set to 0, so it can just reset it to what it was. Is DISCO allowed to set the value from 0 to 1? Or no, DISCO is forbidden from setting an entity to manage 0 if the GUI has already set the current managed status, unmanaged status, excuse me. With a value of 2 or 3, is DISCO allowed to manage that device? Yes. DISCO can set an entity to managed only if that current unmanaged status was set by DISCO, i.e. with the tag managedEntities.stch being setting a value of 2 or 3, then DISCO is allowed to manage that device. Of course, you'd have to change your scope and also change the stitcher to remove any interfaces that were being set to 2. In line number 5, oh, go back please. In line number 5, if it's set to any value, can DISCO set the managed status to 1? The answer is no. DISCO is forbidden from setting the value of managed status to 1. This is only done by the GUI. In line number 6 and 7, can the DISCO set the managed status value to 2 or 3? Yes, DISCO can always set the value to 2 or 3, even if the GUI was previously set to 1. DISCO can override the GUI in that regard, or in that instance. Next slide. The managed status values that the GUI can set. If you have an existing managed status of 0 or 1, then we can set that to 0. In other words, 0 to 0 wouldn't happen, but 1 to 0 you can. These are the GUI is permitted to set an entity to managed if it was the GUI that had previously unmanaged it. So 1 is the managed status value of 1 is always set by the GUI. So you can use the GUI to then reset it back to 0. Anything with the managed status of 2 or 3 is not allowed to be changed or to manage, i.e. to set to 0, because as we know 2 or 3 is set by DISCO, and the GUI is forbidden from setting an entity to managed if it has already been unmanaged by the discovery process. Setting a 0 to or 1 to 1, again this kind of falls in the same line with number 5. The GUI is permitted to unmanage an entity only if it is currently managed. You can go from 0 to 1 without issue. 1 to 1 wouldn't really happen. Again, 2, if a value is set to 2 or 3, are you able to set it to 1 via the GUI? No, the answer is no. The GUI is forbidden from unmanaging an entity if DISCO has already unmanaged it. And then lastly, setting it to 2 or 3 via the GUI is not something that can happen. The GUI is forbidden from unmanaging an entity by setting it to 2 or 3. This is done by the tag managedEntities.stch. And next slide, please. Status propagation. In NSIM, for efficiency reasons, not every entity in the containment hierarchy of a device has to have an explicit entry in the NSIM managed status table. If a chassis entity is set to unmanaged, i.e. 1, then all child entities or subcomponents are considered to be unmanaged by default, and their managed status will be set to 1 by model. If the chassis entity is set to managed 0 in NSIM, then all subcomponents are considered to be managed 2 by default. However, if there exists any explicit entries for subcomponents in the NSIM managed status table, specifying their managed status to be 1, 2, or 3, then their managed status in model will be set accordingly. Basically, status propagation from chassis to subcomponent occurs for managed status values of 1 through 3. And next slide, please. Slide 15. Root cause analysis, RCA. Events correlated to unmanaged entities will not take part in RCA. These events received from external sources, none are generated from the ITNM poller. These are ignored by RCA rules. So these cannot be set to NMOS cause type of root, cause, or suppressed. Managed entities are identified by model's managed status value. When an event goes through the ITNM gateway, the following actions are taken. Event gateway populates the NMOS managed status in the alerts.status table for each event that's correlated with an entity in the topology, and then sets it to 0, 1, 2, or 3. And then RCA is calculated only for those events that have a managed status equal to 0. In the case where you want to process unmanaged events by RCA or for RCA, you can modify the unmanaged status attribute from 1 to 0 in the RCA schema.cfg file, and then restart the gateway. And next slide. And now I'll hand it over to Krishna, and he will cover the tag managed entity stitcher.
Thank you, Bruce, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. So today I'll cover a little bit deeper on the 4.2's changes that is coming from 3.9 customers, right? So what is this unmanaged status? Why someone need to care about it? Little background. So you may be discovering 10,000 devices, whatever. So there may be a subset of interfaces that you don't want to monitor by your network engineers. Or maybe you want to see the less noise in the object server with the number of alerts coming in. That's why you unmanage those interfaces. It also reduces the overhead on the object server. It also reduces overhead on the ITNM gateway to be processed and enriched and do RCA. And also, if they're not keen on them, we want to exclude them. So the poller will have to poll a less number of entities. So overall, it's a win-win using this managed status. In 3.9, the stitcher is called tag managed entity stitcher, and the location is listed there. And whereas in 4x, whether it is 4.1.1 or 4.2, it's a populate D and SIM. The logic is pretty simple there. So we want to manage, let's say you want to unmanage the dialer interfaces. Maybe you have a serial switch that you want to unmanage some of the pop interfaces or whatever they are. So you can just add the logic in the stitcher to unmanage those interfaces. I'll move on to the next slide, slide 17. So how does the stitcher work in 3x? It could be 3.8 or 3.9. So if you look at the diagram, you have the discovery database, it's a combination of multiple sub-databases. You have the lot of agents, you call it details, ASOC, some proprietary agents such as Cisco or vendor specific and whatnot. And then we discover the data from all the devices in phase 1, 2, 3. And then the data get passed to working entities. And we also build the connectivity across those devices based on the agent data. So we build the layers, whether it is a layer 2 or layer 3, we have multiple layers there. So combining that layers connectivity information and also the actual entities, we build the final topology that is called scratch topology.entity by name. And this is just one table that is containing everything of your network. So the tagman entity stitcher runs on this table and it queries the table for the interested entities you want to unmanage, and then it does you can then execute an update statement on the same table. So it's more act on the same table itself, and upon execution at the final stage the entire data is passed on to the model process and then finally into NSIM. So everything is a OQL land, nothing is SQL here. So entire discovery as well as the model. In 3.9 you also have a DNSIM database, which is actually a replacement for a scratch topology, but that's not supported. So not many customers use it because we don't support out of the box. So moving on, so the changes for 4.2. So everything stays same in the discovery database except that scratch topology. What we did was we replaced the scratch topology with the DNSIM database. It is in 4.2 we are using SQLite, whereas in 4.1.1 the DNSIM is nothing but solid DB. So there are two separate databases. And this particular stitcher populate DNSIM managed status that is of 4.2. It queries both set of tables. It queries the working entities and also the DNSIM, because the DNSIM holds all the connectivity information. The working entities does not have any connectivity data. It just has the asset information. So then we query those for the subset of interfaces or whatever the entities you want to unmanage, and then you can do a insert into the DNSIM database into the table called managed status. Treat the DNSIM as same as NSIM database. It's exactly a replica. It is just that you only have that NSIM schema without the other schemas. In the NSIM you have NSIM, NC monitor, NCP GUI, or whatnot. In the DNSIM all you have is that NSIM schema that has the complete asset information, if that makes sense. So once you know the list of entities that you want to unmanage, you can actually do an insert into the managed status and set them to either 2 or 3, whatever values you like. So the DNSIM insert is nothing but equivalent to our NSIM, the actual insert in the OQL land. And finally, the DNSIM data is passed on to the model. Model is still a OQL database, whereas now in 4.2, so you have both OQL and the SQL within the discovery. We'll move on. So the managed status table definition, I just want to say here, we do have several columns in this table, but we only use some of them, mainly entity ID and the status and the change time. Those are the key values that gets used. The username and the maintenance start time, maintenance end time, there was some functionality that they wanted to implement, but that's still not there yet. So let's not go there. So the key aspect I want to highlight here is in 3.9, you can set the managed status to any value. It can be 0, 1, 2, 3, or whatever, say 100. And that gets passed on to model, and then it can pass on to the NSIM database. Remember here, the status is a small integer. That means it can only hold the 2-digit number, integer. So you can have a managed status as value 99, but that value will not be used by the other process such as RCA and all. So you want to restrict your values to only 0, 1, 2, 3. Those are the values that is hard-coded in the actual product. So in 3.9, we have many customers where they set the value to 1 and 0 and whatnot, but that is not honored anymore in 4.2. Only values 2 and 3. That means you want to permanently unmanage some of the interfaces or the entities. That values are only set via discovery. You can't set them to 0, you can't set them to 1. So, so the value goes discover to model to NSIM, or 2 and 3, whereas if you want to unmanage certain device via GUI or using the Perl script or using a direct inserts into the managed status table, that values are passed back to the model. So you insert into the NSIM or you unmanage via GUI, that makes an insert into the table, and then that value is propagated back to model. So those are only 0 and 1. I'll move on. So what's the key change between these two stitchers? The tag managed entities, like I said, it acts on the scratch topology. If you look at the key bit here is the scratch topology as entity info, the array list. And whereas the 4.2, because it works on working entities, the actual column name is different. The array list is local neighbor. And then the list of columns underneath that are same, but the VB list is a different name. So local neighbor versus extra info. That's something you need to keep in mind when you're writing your own stitchers, whatever they are. Now, if you take a scenario, say I want to unmanage certain serial links, and then I want to unmanage, extend that same thing to the device name or entity name containing New York. So what you could do is you can actually extend the logic as long as those attributes are available in the working entities.final entity. You want to update your stitcher rather than writing your own new stitcher. That will be quick and easy, and that will also reduce the overhead on the DNSIM. But in 4.2, again, it's a local neighbor versus 3.9 extra info. If you want to have your own stitcher without touching any default out-of-the-box stitchers, you can write something similar that what I listed there. I'm going to put end of this presentation the text-based that stitcher, so if you want to copy it, that will be easy for you rather than retyping everything. The second scenario is, let's say you want to unmanage all Ethernet interfaces that aren't connected to any other devices, or in other words, they aren't connected to any other, they don't have any connectivity. So because the Ethernet interface are IF type 6, in 3.9 it is just a one-line code in that stitcher. You just look for the extra info IF type, and then the connectivity is also stored in that extra info, either in the reverse related to or related to columns. Related to is the outside the extra info. So you just add that one line statement, but 4.2, obviously the connectivity is buried under DNSIM database. So you will have to find out the interfaces that do not have any connectivity, that are IF type 6, and then make an insert using DNSIM insert into that managed status table. Then the data get passed on to the model, then finally into NSIM. I think that's the same. So you can then, once you develop your own stitcher, you can then call that stitcher either at the end of the existing populate DNSIM managed status stitcher, or you can also use the call it under populate DNSIM table stitcher. I've listed the example there. So either way, it doesn't matter. It depends where exactly you want to call. It's your choice. So let's say you have multiple scenarios. And they don't actually, they may overlap, they may not overlap. You can actually have your own stitcher. That's what I would recommend. You can have your own custom stitcher, combine all your scenarios under that one stitcher. This is an example where the first section is talking about unmanaged all interfaces that aren't connected to any devices. That's section 1. And then if I move on to the second section, it says unmanaged all voice gateway 64 kbps interfaces. If you look at this specific example, the logic I use there is IF type equal to 77, IF speed equal to 64,000. But these columns are actually available under working entities. So the better option for this scenario is extend the logic under default stitcher rather than acting on DNSIM. That reduces the overhead. That may be even time saver as well in terms of the phase -1 processing time in the discovery. So always make sure if your logic requires the connectivity tables and whatnot in the DNSIM, then only come to this phase. But if your attributes are available in working entities, try to make use of the default stitcher and extend it. Some key notes here. So the stitcher validation and other notes. So all the stitcher changes are dynamic. You don't need to restart any process. In 3.9, you can actually check the memory resident definition of the stitcher using OQL. But you won't know if the stitcher is working or not unless the stitcher is called. But you can see, you can read that content, what is there in the memory. In 4.2, we actually removed that piece. You can't query any more stitcher definitions via OQL. And the best way to look at it is you want to look at the discovery log to see any errors or updates. And then while you're executing the stitcher, if there are any errors, that should be thrown into the trace and logs of the discovery. In the OQL land, the execute OQL goes with the retrieve OQL. Retrieve OQL is retrieving a set of entities from any table, and then you do execute, either update that particular table, whatever that is. The equivalency here for the SQL, you can be on using DNSIM or NSIM, right? You may have a stitchers that may be calling the data from NSIM database. That is the same thing for DNSIM as well. There is nothing different. So you prepare the SQL, and then you execute the SQL, right? So because that's the actual database. And one thing to remember, OQL is case sensitive. So if you have any camel case, you have to match exactly how they are. Whereas while you are querying the SQL, either it is a DNSIM or NSIM, you can just, it is a case insensitive. What I can do is I want to do a quick demo of that one of the stitcher and do a validation. The idea here is, let's say you have written a stitcher, you want to validate how you want to actually check where it is working, where it is broken. Hopefully this will help. Let me just come out of it. Bruce, do you see my party connection manager?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I have several tabs here. Pretty much all of them belong to one server except the 3.9 and the distributed. So this is 4.2. So at the moment I'm in the same $NC home precision disco stitchers and DNSIM. The stitcher I have written to unmanage all the interfaces of Ethernet type and that are not connected to anything, and there is a logic here, right? You are querying the entity data, and then you are trying to find the interfaces, and then you are doing a join with the connects. Connects table is the one that holds all the connectivity. Whichever the interface is not found in this table, we are actually unmanaging all of them. By no way I'm a DBA, so if you are a DBA listening to this, so you may write a better query than this. So this is just an example. So once you have written your own stitcher, whatever you want to do with your logic, whatever your requirement may be, the best thing is log on to your DNSIM database. So I have a domain called MS running here. So the domain MS service DNSIM. This is some service DNSIM is new for 4.2. You can also query in 4.1.1, but you have to pass a different parameter, -dbid, rather than DNSIM. It doesn't require any credentials. If you like, you can add some latency. It's not compulsory. So whatever the query you have set in your stitcher, you just copy and paste that one here and see what happens. So you have total 25 interfaces that do not have any connectivity in your Discover topology. Now, if you log on to your discovery, all right, so it says my discovery mode is 1, which is I'm in standby mode. I have already completed one cycle, at least one cycle. So I have total 4 devices in this domain. And if you actually restitch the topology, it's already there in DNSIM, all the data. You don't need to restitch it. But if you want to track it, if that, say, I make some change to this particular stitcher, I haven't made any changes, but what I'll do is I'll just save it. And then if you come back here in the disco log, if you try to (11:12). So as you can see, at 11:12, the stitcher changes are being picked up by the disco process. Then what I want to do is I want to call that stitcher. Either you can call exclusively that stitcher itself, or if that stitcher is impacting many devices, like in my case, all four devices, what you can do is you can rebuild phase -1, right? You don't need to run phase 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to rebuild entire topology of phase -1. So I execute create and send topology, and you say go. And if you actually look for the disco log, it is telling you here once the stitcher has been updated, then we executed create and send topology, wherever that is. Yeah. And it is building the working entities table, and then it has built the layers, and then finally the DNSIM has started. And then you can see here there is also some specific inserts into the managed status table here. You can print the devices that are impacted by your queries. You can update your logic saying which queries are actually, which entities are actually impacted. And then if you go back to your DNSIM again, say I want to find out what is the actual managed status value for these, maybe let's pick up last two. Select star from DNSIM.managedStatus. Remember here I'm not following any camel case or anything, where entity ID and say 146 and 147. So I have 2 rows here. And then let's now, so the stitcher is working. You can see those interfaces are updated with the status 2. And if you also look at the actual stitcher, it is setting the managed status equal to 2. And then you can now check at the model database, right? The disco pass it to model. Remember, the model is completely OQL-LAN. It doesn't have any SQL at all. So you can look for what database it has. So all the data is in NSIM cache. It's pretty much a replica of NSIM as well. So now you want to look for those two interfaces, right? Because one caveat here is you have entity ID in the DNSIM database. It is not the same entity ID in the model. The DNSIM has its own set of entity IDs. They don't match with the model. So don't go by that. So I'm going to pick up these two interfaces. So as I can see here, I have not typed appropriately the case-sensitive, the table name. That's why it failed, because it's OQL. So I do have now the two records. Let's look for entity name and also the actual object ID for that particular two interfaces, right? So to make it easier, I just enabled the tab mode. So as you can see, you have two entities here. The entity ID is different from DNSIM. Now if you log on to the NSIM database, when you are querying NSIM, you must pass the username and the password that you have set during your database setup, right? So I want to see here nsim.managedStatus, where entity ID in these two values, 11 blah, and then 41. So remember, the tab on is only available via NCP OQL. I'm actually querying from the core, but the actual database is sitting on a different host, right? So now, if you really want to validate this teacher, so go ahead and change this value to maybe, like I said, say I want to say change it to 3, right? I change the value to 3, and I want to wait for that discovery to pick up that change. The interval is every 60 seconds, so it depends where we broke up last cycle, so when it has done it. So you may be waiting for close to 60 seconds or maybe very less. Depends when was the last cycle. One minute looks very long. All right. Okay, so I can see now the structure changes have been picked up by the discovery. So what I'll do now is I'm going to execute the same command, create and send topology, so I can see all the interfaces going from status 2 to 3, right? And you can tail the log. It says it is done. It is back to, again, standby mode. Now I want to go back to the DNSIM and look for the same entity, see what is happening. So now the values are 3, right? And query the model. The model, if you look for nsim.managedStatus, where So the value is 3 here, as you can see. And then if you finally query the NSIM database, and the value is now 3. So if you are trying to set up your own stitcher and whatnot, so you may want to follow this so that you don't miss anywhere. So you first want to check if that query is right, querying the DNSIM itself, and make sure those entities are your interest that you want to unmanage, and then validate them. Yeah, that's pretty much it. And 3.9, I don't think we need to talk much because everything goes under scratch topology.entity by name. So there's nothing new there. So I'll skip that part to demo. With that, I would like to stop here and look at the questions we may have any. So we have a few questions that came in prior to the webcast. So the couple of questions are how RCA works in the managed and unmanaged status. I think that's pretty much covered by Bruce. Just to recap, if the entity is unmanaged, we enrich, but we don't do RCA. So the gateway does enrichment. And then the second question is investigating devices. You can SNMP walk from object server with the passwords that appear do not show up in the discovery database. So I think that requires some sort of troubleshooting and which version you are on. If you are on 3.9, Fixpack 3 and earlier versions, you may be hitting some of the known issues. Those issues are addressed in Fixpack 4 and 3.9 and later versions. You may want to get there. But if you want to work around that, there is a procedure. I'm going to post that question in the forum, and I'm going to post a URL, what steps you need to take to address that within ITNM if you are using older version. The third question is ITNM in brief. I'm not sure if you can talk brief. What exactly you are looking at, I don't know. So there are many aspects of ITNM, but if you are looking for how actually overall ITNM works, the data flow, or actually the functionality of ITNM, probably you can send me email with your question or requirement. Probably I'll try to answer that. But if you want to say in a couple of words, what is ITNM? It's an event correlation engine based on the Discover topology. So we try to reduce the number of events based on what we discover. The last question I have there is, please explain the database structures used by ITNM to display status of interfaces, etc. Can they be populated by a script? So as I read that question, it's for me it's like a twofold question. One is display status of interfaces. Are you talking about the managed status itself, or are you talking about the event association? So let's say you have a device with 10 interfaces. Maybe they may have 5 events, some for the interfaces, some for the chassis. So mostly the first part, the device with the interface and managed status, those queries are proprietary. I don't think we have published anything out there, but same thing goes for the actual event status. But if you look at our ITNM docs, there is a reference guide which has a lot of queries that talks about containment and pulling all the interfaces that have with a specific containment and whatnot. Probably you can use that as a reference and take it from there. But if that is not helping you, feel free to send me email, then I would be happy to answer that. Reading the other question, did you paste the stitcher text? So I'm going to add those stitcher texts at the end of the presentation, so you have it. You can copy and paste into your wherever you like. Is there an ETA for ITNM 3.9 Fixpack 5? I think it is due next month, September 3rd week. That's the estimate. And so no difference between calling the custom stitcher and the managed stitcher or popular. Really, it's up to you where you want to call that stitcher. You can have your own stitcher just to keep it. We have some customers where the tag managed stitcher is probably like 10 pages long. You can imagine the number of stanzas they may have for various requirements. So in that case, I would have them a custom stitcher rather than burying everything under the default stitcher. That's one part. But calling from managed status or populated NSIM, I don't think it makes any difference, but you can call from anywhere. That's the list of questions I'm seeing. How can we only call one stitcher? So within that database here, so here you are calling, if you are looking at my screen, insert into stitches.action, create and send topology. So here all you do is the populate DNSIM. The key aspect is if you are calling populate DNSIM, your discovery must be in standby mode and it has completed at least one cycle. Otherwise, the populate DNSIM doesn't make sense. Right? You have to have the agent data. And that DNSIM should have all the existing data so that the stitcher can act upon some data. Right. In 3.8 or 3.9 documentation, there was a diagram of the flow of stitchers. Is there such diagram in 4.2? I'm not sure, but yeah, so there is some diagram internally that we have. I'll see if we can share that with some changes. I'll take that offline. Thanks for that question. I don't see anything else. Any last questions? Yeah, so the slide will be posted, deck will be posted tomorrow along with these replay crap on the same user group. I think, Kelsey, I don't see any more questions. I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you everyone for attending today's webcast. Feel free to continue any discussions in the Optimizing IT and Service Management discussion forum. The link is located in your chat box right now. Again, the recording and slides will be available tomorrow in the webcast archives. You'll receive a follow-up email with a link to those. As you exit, please take a few moments to fill out the post-event survey. This helps us improve future events. We truly appreciate your feedback on that, and this concludes today's event. Thank you all and have a fantastic day.
Thank you.